The first confirmed contact between humanity and an interstellar civilization did not happen with ceremony. There were no speeches drafted in advance. No world leaders gathered at a podium beneath a clear sky. There was no moment of collective breath held across 7 billion people watching a single screen. It happened at 0314 hours Greenwich Mean Time, on a Tuesday in late November, in the basement of a repurposed Cold War-era radio telescope facility outside Zelenchukskaya, Russia, staffed by 11 people, 8 of whom were asleep. Dr. Priya Anand was not asleep. She had been analyzing signal drift data from a routine deep field survey when the pattern appeared. She initially assumed instrument error, then software corruption. Then she ran the signal through 4 separate diagnostic filters, cross-referenced it against every known natural source in the catalogs, and sat very still for approximately 40 seconds before she picked up the phone. The signal was not a greeting. It was not a mathematical sequence designed to communicate peaceful intent. It was, as far as the linguistics team assembled over the following 72 hours could determine, something closer to a navigational ping, the kind of automated transponder burst a vessel broadcasts when entering a region it does not have detailed charts for. Whoever sent it was not looking to make friends. They were looking for obstacles. The United Earth Aerospace Directorate, known in most official documents simply as UAD, was a relatively young institution. Formed 23 years earlier from the dissolved remnants of several national space agencies, it had consolidated humanity's off-world presence into a coherent, if bureaucratically frustrating, single command structure. Its mandate was exploration, infrastructure, and, increasingly, defense. Director General Amara Osei received Anand's report at 0600 hours. By 0900 she had convened a closed session of the Directorate's Senior Scientific Advisory Panel. By 1400, a secondary session was already running in parallel with representatives from the UN Security Council's newly classified Space Affairs Subcommittee, a body that technically did not exist in public record. What we know, Osei said, standing before a display showing the signal source trajectory, is that this originated from approximately 4.2 light-years away. It reached us traveling at a wavelength consistent with deliberate broadcast. It carries embedded coordinate data. And the coordinate data includes this solar system. The room was silent. They know we're here, said Admiral Kwame Asante, UAD Fleet Command. The question is, how long have they known? That question would take months to answer, and the answer, when it came, would be deeply unsettling. The embedded coordinates were not a recent addition to the signal. Based on the decay signature of the carrier wave, the message had been in transit for over 60 years, meaning it had been sent around 1962, when humanity's most advanced spacecraft were barely reaching orbit. 60 years. The signal had been traveling toward them for 60 years, and no one had been listening carefully enough to hear it until now. The second signal came 11 days later. This one was different. It was directional, aimed precisely at Earth, not broadcast outward. It used a narrower frequency band, one that suggested the sender had, in the interval, located a more precise fix on their position. The linguistics team identified what appeared to be a query structure embedded in the data. Not a greeting. A question. They spent 3 weeks debating what the question was. The leading interpretation, eventually endorsed by a majority of the panel, was something approximating, "What is your authorization level for this sector?" Not, "Are you intelligent?" Not, "Do you come in peace?" Not even, "Who are you?" What is your authorization level for this sector? It implied a framework. It implied bureaucracy. It implied that space, or at least this part of it, operated according to some system of permissions and classifications that humanity had never been informed of, and had apparently been in violation of simply by existing where they existed. Dr. Anand, in a closed session briefing later declassified only partially, described her reaction this way: "It was like receiving a parking ticket from a civilization you didn't know existed, for a parking space you built yourself, on land your ancestors lived on for 100,000 years. The UAD's response team debated for 6 days before transmitting anything back. The temptation to answer immediately was strong, but Director General Osei overruled it. "We don't answer questions we don't understand," she said, "from entities we don't know, about systems we haven't reviewed." She assigned a team of international law scholars, military strategists, linguists, and physicists to draft what she called a calibrated non-answer, a response that acknowledged the signal without conceding anything. What they sent back was, in essence, a request for clarification. Formatted as carefully as they could manage using the structural patterns extracted from the incoming signals, it asked, "Please define sector parameters and authorization framework." The reply came 6 weeks later. It was long. Extraordinarily long. When fully decoded, it ran to over 900 pages of dense technical and administrative text. The translation process took 4 months and involved a rotating team of 200 specialists. When the summary document was finally placed on Osei's desk, she read it twice, set it down, and said nothing for a very long time. What it described was a governing body. Not a single civilization, a collective of over 300 spacefaring species, organized under a structure they called, in the closest translation available, the Galactic Administrative Compact. The Compact maintained jurisdiction over interstellar transit corridors, resource extraction zones, and, critically, what it termed emerging civilization buffer zones. Buffer zones. Humanity, it turned out, was inside one. The Sol system had been designated a buffer zone, a region of protected, restricted space, approximately 400 years ago, following a survey mission that had detected early-stage industrial civilization on Earth's surface. The designation was meant to be protective. No compact member species was authorized to make contact with, trade with, exploit, or interfere with a protected buffer zone civilization until that civilization had independently achieved certain developmental benchmarks. The benchmarks were listed in the document. Humanity had technically cleared 4 of the 7. Independently. Without knowing they were being evaluated. The 5th benchmark was demonstrated capacity for coordinated interstellar defense. The Compact had not expected that one to be cleared anytime soon. They had not accounted for what humanity does when it feels watched. The 900-page Compact transmission contained a great deal of administrative language, bureaucratic procedure, and dense historical context that took months to translate with any confidence. But buried in Section 47 of what the UAD's translation team labeled the Jurisdictional Framework Annex, was a sentence that, once understood, changed the nature of every conversation happening in every classified briefing room on Earth. The sentence read, in closest translation, observation assets assigned to Sol Buffer Zone remain active and positioned per Standing Compact Directive. Observation assets. Positioned. Active. There were ships in the solar system that didn't belong to humanity. There had been, for an unknown period of time. Watching. Admiral Kwame Asante had spent 31 years in space operations. He had overseen the construction of 3 orbital defense platforms, commanded 2 deep space survey missions, and written the UAD's current threat assessment framework from scratch. He was not a man given to visible alarm. When the translation team's lead, Dr. Yusuf Bello, delivered the finding in person, Asante read the relevant passage 4 times, set the tablet down, and asked one question. How many? Bello shook his head. We don't know. The document refers to a standard observation complement, 4 buffer zones of Sol's classification, but doesn't specify numbers. Based on the bureaucratic tone, I think they consider it routine. Routine, Asante repeated. Standard procedure. Like maintaining a weather buoy. Asante stood up, walked to the viewport of the Directorate's orbital headquarters, a modest ring station in mid-Earth orbit, and looked out at the dark. Find them, he said. The search took 4 months and required the quiet reorientation of 17 deep space tracking arrays, 6 long-range gravimetric sensor platforms, and the coordinated analysis of 2 years of anomalous telemetry data that had previously been filed as instrument noise or unexplained background phenomena. What they found was not a fleet in any military sense. It was not a battle formation or an aggressive posture. It was, as Dr. Bello had suggested, more like infrastructure. A network of 11 objects distributed at significant distances throughout the outer solar system, beyond the orbit of Neptune, in the deep shadow of the heliopause. The objects were small by the standards the UAD had imagined for interstellar vessels. The largest registered at approximately 40 meters in length. They emitted almost nothing, no active propulsion signatures, no detectable communication beyond an extremely faint low-frequency carrier wave that, once identified, turned out to have been present in Earth's background signal environment for at least 60 years. They had been hiding in the noise. Specifically in the noise. The carrier frequency sat precisely at the intersection of Jupiter's magnetospheric emissions and a natural hydrogen line, a location that any civilization monitoring for alien signals would have learned to filter out as interference. It was not an accident. It was deliberate concealment, executed with a precision that implied a very detailed understanding of how a developing civilization builds its early detection infrastructure. They knew exactly where we'd look, said Dr. Chinwei, the astrophysicist who led the detection effort, in a briefing that remained classified for 3 years. And they knew exactly where we wouldn't. The strategic implications were debated exhaustively. There were voices, some of them loud, arguing that the observation platforms represented a fundamental violation of sovereignty, that an unauthorized foreign presence in the solar system, regardless of intent, demanded an immediate and forceful response. These voices were not ignored. They were, however, carefully contextualized. Director General Osei convened what became known internally as the Strategic Patience Council, a rotating body of senior military, diplomatic, scientific and legal advisors tasked with developing a response framework that was neither naive nor reckless. Their first official document, produced after 6 weeks of deliberation, opened with a line that became something of an unofficial motto for the entire Terran exclusion zone affair. "We are not in a position of weakness. We are in a position of incomplete information. These are different things and confusing them will get people killed." The distinction mattered enormously. Humanity had, in the previous century, developed a space presence of meaningful scale. The UAD maintained a fleet of 47 crewed vessels, ranging from the small fast courier class to the 3 heavy platform carriers currently assigned to the Outer System Survey Program. It operated 11 permanent orbital installations, managed 3 established off-world extraction operations in the asteroid belt and on Titan, and had, as of 8 years prior, achieved practical fusion drive propulsion, a development that had quietly cut transit times to the outer system by 60% and given human vessels a performance envelope that nobody outside UAD's classified divisions fully appreciated. Humanity was not, in other words, a primitive civilization standing terrified in the dark. It was a civilization that had been doing the work while nobody, or rather nobody it knew about, was grading the results. The compact's benchmarks had been set based on projections. And humanity had, characteristically, exceeded the projections. The decision about what to do with the observation platforms required 6 months to reach. Not because the answer was unclear but because the way it was done mattered as much as what was done. Osei ultimately rejected 3 proposed courses of action before endorsing a 4th. She rejected a direct military intercept as potentially escalatory with an unknown partner whose full capabilities were not understood. She rejected a formal diplomatic protest as premature, given that the full translation of the compact's framework was not yet complete. She rejected doing nothing as strategically unacceptable. Allowing unknown foreign assets to operate in the solar system without acknowledgement was not a posture any serious defense framework could sustain. What she approved was what the strategic team called acknowledged presence. Using the same low-frequency carrier band the observation platforms had been using, UAD transmitted a short, technically formatted message directly to the nearest confirmed platform location. The message was brief. It contained the platform's precise coordinates, demonstrating that it had been found, a timestamp and a single structured phrase that the linguistics team had spent 3 weeks calibrating. In closest translation, "We are aware of your position. We are reviewing the framework you have transmitted. Formal response is pending. Please maintain current posture and do not approach inner system boundary without prior notification." It was not a threat. It was not a welcome. It was a boundary stated plainly and calmly, by a civilization that had just discovered it was being watched, and had decided that the correct response to being watched was to make clear it had noticed, without flinching. The platforms did not respond directly. But within 72 hours their carrier signal frequency shifted, a small technical change that the UAD's monitoring team interpreted, after considerable analysis, as acknowledgement. The compact's observation assets had heard them. And they had, apparently, recognized something in the tone of the message that warranted a cautious, quiet step back. Asante, reviewing the telemetry in his office at 2,200 hours, permitted himself a small, controlled expression of satisfaction. "Good," he said to no one in particular. "Now they know we're paying attention." The Galactic Administrative Compact, as humanity came to understand it over the following 18 months of careful translation work, was not a monolithic government. It was closer, in structure, to a very old multilateral treaty organization, something between the United Nations and a trade alliance, with judicial powers and a shared military framework layered on top. Its 300-plus member species had joined at different times, under different circumstances, with different levels of enthusiasm. Many had been incorporated through negotiation. Some had been incorporated through the kind of pressure that doesn't leave visible marks. And then there was the Vethri hegemony. The Vethri were not the largest species in the compact, nor the oldest. But they were, by most measures available in the documentation humanity received, the most consistently influential. They had been members for over 2,000 years. They had served on the compact's governing council for the majority of that time. They controlled, through a combination of treaty rights, historical claim and sheer logistical capacity, the majority of the interstellar transit corridors in what the compact designated as the inner spiral reach, which included, as humanity discovered with considerable interest, the transit lanes closest to Sol. In practice, what this meant was that any ship traveling to or from the Sol buffer zone through standard compact routes would be traveling through Vethri-administered space. The Vethri did not own those routes, but they managed them. And over 2,000 years, the difference between managing something and owning it tends to become academic. The Vethri envoy arrived at the outer edge of the solar system 14 months after humanity's first acknowledged contact with the compact's observation platforms. It did not announce itself in advance. It appeared, a vessel registering at approximately 400 meters in length, accompanied by a 6-ship escort formation that the UAD's outer system tracking network classified as likely combat-capable, based on energy signature and structural geometry, at a point just beyond the heliopause, holding position at what turned out to be exactly the minimum respectful distance specified in the compact's diplomatic protocol. They had, at least, read the manuals. The vessel broadcast a standard compact diplomatic identification on a frequency the UAD was now monitoring continuously. The translation came back within hours because the linguistics team had, by this point, become genuinely good at their work. The identification identified the vessel as the Primacy of Terms, Diplomatic Registry of the Vethri Hegemony, carrying a senior envoy authorized to conduct formal first contact proceedings with the Sol Buffer Zone civilization in accordance with Compact Benchmark Protocol 7. Benchmark 7. The fifth developmental benchmark, demonstrated capacity for coordinated interstellar defense, had apparently triggered a review, and the Vethri had volunteered to conduct it. Director General Osei, reading the translated identification at her desk, asked for a full briefing on the Vethri before she authorized any response. What she received over the next 48 hours was extensive, drawn from the compact documents and, carefully read, deeply informative about what was actually happening. The Vethri had conducted the initial contact proceedings for 11 of the last 15 species to be admitted to the compact. Of those 11, 8 had entered with treaty terms heavily favorable to Vethri transit interests. 2 had experienced what the documents described as extended provisional status, a classification that, reading between the bureaucratic lines, appeared to involve significant ongoing supervision. 1 had been reclassified as a non-participant protected zone, a designation with no membership rights attached. The Vethri were not coming to welcome humanity to the community of spacefaring civilizations. They were coming to assess the terms under which humanity would be incorporated, and, almost certainly, to shape those terms in ways that served Vethri interests. Admiral Asante's assessment of the escort formation, submitted the same day, was precise and deliberately unalarming in tone. The 6 escort vessels were capable. Their energy signatures suggested drive systems significantly more powerful than anything in the UAD's current fleet. Their sensor profiles indicated advanced detection capability. In a direct engagement at open range, the honest assessment was that the UAD could not guarantee a favorable outcome with the assets currently in the outer system. But Asante's memo concluded with a paragraph that Osei later described as one of the most important documents of the entire Terran exclusion zone affair. The escort's posture is demonstrative, not aggressive. Its positioning is consistent with a negotiating formation, visible enough to register capability, distant enough to avoid provocation. The Vethri are sophisticated enough to know that arriving with overt military threat in a first formal meeting would undermine their own diplomatic standing within the compact. They are showing us a capability ceiling, not a trigger. The correct response is to demonstrate that we have read the situation accurately, and that we have a ceiling of our own. Osei authorized 2 responses simultaneously. The first was a formal diplomatic acknowledgement, transmitted to the Primacy of Terms in compact standard protocol format, establishing humanity's willingness to receive an envoy and requesting a proposed agenda for proceedings. The second was an order to the 3 UAD heavy platform carriers currently assigned to the Outer System Survey Program to alter their survey routes by a modest, well-documented degree, routes that happened to bring them into close proximity with the transit approach vector from the heliopause to the inner system. This was not described as a defensive repositioning. It was not framed as a military response. The carriers continued broadcasting standard survey telemetry. They simply happened to be doing their survey work in a location that any competent navigation officer would recognize as a significant choke point. The Vethri navigation officer, it turned out, was very competent. The Primacy of Terms took 14 hours to respond to the diplomatic acknowledgement. During those 14 hours, its sensor profile changed in ways that the UAD's tracking team interpreted as active, intensive scanning of the repositioned carriers. When the response came, it was polite, formally correct, and, notably, included a request to adjust the proposed meeting timeline by 3 weeks, citing scheduling considerations. 3 weeks, during which the Vetheri envoy held position at the heliopause and, presumably, composed a significantly revised briefing for whoever had sent them. Dr. Bello, when informed, allowed himself a rare moment of open satisfaction. "They came expecting to grade us," he said. "They weren't expecting to be surprised by the student." The formal proceedings, when they eventually began, were conducted via a translation relay, a technological bridge the Compact's observation platforms extended at the Vetheri envoy's request, connecting to UAD's communication systems in high orbit. The first session lasted 11 hours. The Vetheri senior envoy, whose name translated approximately as arbitrator of established precedent, a title that told you most of what you needed to know about their expectations, opened with a long recitation of Compact framework, benchmark requirements, and standard admission procedures. Osei let her team listen. She took notes. She asked precise, narrow questions that forced specific, committed answers. She did not agree to anything. She did not refuse anything. She was, by every account of the people in the room with her, the most disciplined negotiator any of them had ever seen in operation. At the session's close, the Vetheri envoy proposed a standard framework for provisional admission proceedings. Osei said humanity would require time to review the proposal in full before responding. The envoy indicated this was acceptable, per Compact protocol. Then Osei said something that was not in any protocol. "We appreciate the Compact's interest in formalizing our status," she said, through the translation relay, her voice completely level. "We want to be transparent that we have reviewed the admission terms extended to previous civilizations, and we have some questions about variance in those terms. We look forward to discussing those questions in the next session." The translation relay recorded a pause of 9 seconds before the envoy's response. 9 seconds, for a species whose communication patterns suggested natural response times of less than 1. "That will be noted on the agenda," the envoy said. It was the first indication that the Vetheri had arrived expecting a very different kind of conversation, and were beginning to understand they were not going to get it. In the weeks between the first and second formal sessions with the Vetheri envoy, the UAD's legal and diplomatic team produced what internally became known simply as the counter-document. It was not a rejection of the Compact's framework. It was not a declaration of independence or a refusal to engage. It was, technically, a response to the provisional admission proposal, submitted in the correct format, using Compact standard protocol terminology throughout, referencing the relevant clauses of the framework with scrupulous accuracy. It was also, as the Vetheri delegation apparently took some time to fully process, a comprehensive and methodically structured argument that approximately 40% of the standard provisional admission terms were either inapplicable to humanity's specific situation, inconsistent with precedents established in 3 earlier admission proceedings that the Compact's own records documented, or in tension with foundational principles articulated in the Compact's original charter. The team that produced it was led by Dr. Amara Osei's former law school colleague, Professor Hannah Kirchner, a specialist in international treaty law who had spent the previous 14 months becoming, through sustained and concentrated effort, possibly the most knowledgeable human alive on the subject of Compact administrative jurisprudence. She had a gift for reading bureaucratic language and identifying the exact sentences that the people who wrote them had hoped no one would look at too carefully. The Vetheri's review of the counter-document took 11 days. Their response, when it came, was formally polite and substantively significant. They were requesting a 2-week recess to consult with relevant Compact advisory bodies. It was the first time, as far as the translation team could determine from the Compact's available historical records, that a buffer zone civilization had submitted documentation that required the Vetheri to seek outside consultation before responding. They didn't have an answer ready, Kirchner told Osei, with the careful restraint of someone who was very pleased but unwilling to celebrate prematurely. They came with a playbook. We didn't run the plays they expected. The recess became 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, the UAD's communication monitoring recorded a significant increase in signal traffic between the primacy of terms and Compact space, traffic that the observation platform near the heliopause appeared to be relaying. Whatever was being discussed, it involved a level of consultation that the Vetheri had evidently not anticipated needing. Admiral Asante used the time productively. The 3 heavy platform carriers in the outer system completed their revised survey patterns and rotated to maintenance status, replaced by 2 of the UAD's newer fast-response vessels. Smaller, more maneuverable, equipped with the second-generation fusion drives that had entered service 18 months prior. The change was logged in standard fleet rotation records and broadcast on open UAD operational channels. Nothing classified. Nothing hidden. Simply good operational housekeeping. The primacy of terms scanned the new vessels within hours of their arrival at the outer system waypoint. Asante reviewed the sensor query log the following morning and made a single notation in his operational diary: they noticed. When the second formal session convened, the Vethari envoy's tone had changed in ways that were subtle but, to Osei's team, unmistakable. The envoy opened by acknowledging that humanity's submission had raised points meriting substantive consideration, a phrase that Bello flagged as significant, noting that compact diplomatic language of this era typically used the word noted 4 points it intended to dismiss and meriting consideration, 4 points it had been forced to take seriously. What followed was 7 hours of genuinely complex negotiation. Not the formality of the first session, but a working discussion with real movement on both sides. The Vethari conceded 3 of the 14 points humanity had contested. On 4 others they proposed modified language. On the remaining 7 they maintained their position, but provided substantive arguments rather than citations to framework precedent. It was, as Kirchner said in her session debrief, the difference between someone explaining why they can't give you what you want and someone who has checked and found out the rules actually require them to consider it. The contested points were not trivial. They addressed 3 issues of particular strategic significance to humanity's long-term position. The first was transit rights. The standard provisional admission framework gave the compact, and practically speaking the Vethari as the administering party for the nearest transit corridors, significant oversight authority over a new member's interstellar travel, including the right to require prior authorization for vessels traveling outside the home system during the provisional period. Humanity's counter-document argued, based on the precedent of 2 earlier admissions involving civilizations with established multi-body operations, one species had a colony on a moon of their gas giant, another had active resource extraction in their asteroid belt, that any civilization with demonstrated, ongoing operations in multiple locations within their home system was entitled to unrestricted transit within a defined home system zone without compact authorization. The Vethari had initially rejected this entirely. After the recess, they accepted modified language defining the home system zone, though the definition they proposed was significantly smaller than humanity had requested. Osei didn't accept their definition. She offered a counter-definition. They went 3 rounds on the boundary coordinates before settling on language that left the practical boundary considerably further out than the Vethari's initial offer, encompassing, among other things, the entirety of humanity's current asteroid belt operations. The second contested point was benchmark assessment authority. The standard framework gave the compact's designated first contact party, again practically speaking the Vethari, the authority to conduct and certify the assessment of whether a civilization had cleared the remaining developmental benchmarks required for full membership. Humanity's position was that benchmark assessment should be conducted by a joint panel including compact members with no direct economic interest in the outcome. This was, as everyone in the room understood, a direct challenge to Vethari authority over the process. The Vethari rejected it in the second session. Osei thanked them for their position and moved to the next point. She returned to it in the third session, in the 5th, and in the 7th, each time with additional documentation, additional precedent, additional specific examples of cases where the administering party's economic interests had demonstrably influenced assessment outcomes in ways the compact's own review bodies had later flagged as irregular. She was not aggressive about it. She was persistent. There is a difference. Aggression can be dismissed. Persistence, when backed by evidence and delivered with complete composure, is much harder to handle. The third contested point was the most important, and the one the Vethari were most determined to hold. The standard provisional admission framework included a clause, standard language, present in virtually every admission proceeding, that during the provisional period the admitting civilization was expected to coordinate any significant military development or deployment with the compact's security advisory body. This coordination requirement was framed as protective, ensuring that a new civilization's defense activities did not inadvertently create tensions with established compact members. In practice, as Kirchner had documented in exhaustive detail, it meant that for the duration of the provisional period, which averaged across the compact's history approximately 40 years, a new member's military and defense decisions were subject to compact review and, potentially, veto. 40 years. During which the Vethari administered the nearest transit corridors. Osei's position on this point was simple, clear and non-negotiable. Humanity would not accept any external oversight authority over defensive operations within the Sol system. Full stop. She was willing to discuss information sharing, consultation frameworks, and transparency measures. She was not willing to accept a veto, or anything that functioned as one, over decisions made to protect the home system. The Vethri came back to this point in every session. So did Ose. For 6 sessions it remained unresolved. In the 7th session the Vethri envoy requested a private consultation, just the envoy, Ose, and a single translator each without the full delegations present. Ose agreed. The private session lasted 4 hours. Its content was not released in the declassified record for 11 years. When it contained one exchange that every subsequent commentary on the Terran exclusion zone affair quoted at length. The envoy had said, "Your position on this point is unusual for a civilization at your developmental stage." Ose had replied, "We're aware that it's unusual. We'd like to understand what you find unusual about it." Pause. Then the envoy, "Most civilizations at this stage are grateful for the protection that compact oversight provides." And Ose calmly, "We appreciate the intent. But we don't believe we need protection from the inside of our own system. If there's something outside our system that the compact believes poses a risk to us, we'd welcome that information. And then we'd like to handle it ourselves." Another pause. Longer this time. "You are very confident," the envoy said. "We're realistic," Ose replied. "There's a difference." The 7th formal negotiating session ended without resolution on the military oversight clause. The Vethri envoy cited the need for further consultation. Ose accepted this with characteristic composure and proposed a timeline for the 8th session. The envoy agreed to the timeline, and the primacy of terms withdrew to its holding position at the heliopause. What happened next was not, in the official compact record, described as a test. The Vethri hegemony maintained, in every subsequent diplomatic communication, that the events of what the UAD designated the Waypoint 11 incident were the result of a navigation error by an independent Vethri commercial survey vessel that had inadvertently entered the Sol buffer zone's inner transit approach without proper authorization. Nobody who reviewed the available evidence believed this. The vessel in question appeared on UAD's outer system tracking network on a Thursday morning, approximately 6 weeks into the recess between the 7th and proposed 8th negotiating sessions. It was registering as a commercial class, consistent with mineral survey or cargo transport operations. It was not broadcasting a diplomatic identification. It was not broadcasting any compact identification at all, which, under the framework documents, was itself a violation of buffer zone protocols. It was traveling at a velocity that put it on an intercept course with the inner system, specifically with the transit corridor approach between the heliopause and Jupiter's orbital path. Waypoint 11 was the UAD's designation for the outer anchor of that transit corridor, a gravitational reference point that humanity's outer system survey operations had been using as a navigation marker for 8 years. It had no physical installation. It was a coordinate. But it was a coordinate that sat precisely at the entry point of the most direct approach route from compact space to the inner solar system. A vessel approaching Waypoint 11 from the heading and at the speed the unidentified Vethri ship was traveling would reach Jupiter's orbital path in approximately 11 days. From there, it could reach Earth in another 3. Captain Yaram Beki commanded the UAD fast response vessel Resolute, one of the 2 second-generation ships Asanti had rotated into the outer system during the negotiating recess. She received the tracking alert at 0847 hours and had a preliminary assessment on Asanti's desk by 0930. Her assessment was brief and direct. Unknown vessel, probable Vethri registry based on drive signature match. No authorization broadcast. Current heading intersects Waypoint 11 in 41 hours. Recommend intercept and communication attempt at maximum convenient range. Asanti approved the intercept within the hour. He also, with careful deliberate timing, transmitted an updated operational status report to the primacy of terms communication frequency. A routine report, formatted exactly as all previous operational status reports had been formatted, noting that the Resolute was conducting a standard outer system navigation check and that UAD tracking was currently monitoring an unidentified vessel at specified coordinates. It was not a threat. It was information. Formally, officially, unambiguously shared. The primacy of terms acknowledged receipt of the status report 12 minutes later. It was the fastest acknowledgement the Vethri had ever provided to any UAD communication. Captain Beki brought the Resolute alongside the unidentified vessel at a distance of approximately 80,000 kilometers, close enough for detailed sensor work, far enough to avoid any reading as aggressive posturing. The Resolute was broadcasting full identification transponder data, and a communication hail on every compact standard frequency the UAD had catalogued. The unidentified vessel took 4 hours to respond. When it did, its identification broadcast finally came online, a commercial survey registry from a Vethri corporate entity. It described the vessel as having experienced navigation system issues that had resulted in unintended course deviation. It apologized for the failure to broadcast identification and indicated it was correcting course. Mbeki acknowledged the communication, noted the vessel's stated course correction in her log and maintained position. She did not move away. She did not challenge the explanation. She continued conducting her navigation check, which happened to involve continuous, detailed sensor documentation of the Vethri vessel from 80,000 kilometers, its drive output, its hull configuration, its internal energy signatures, its sensor array activity. The Vethri vessel spent 6 hours correcting its navigation system. During those 6 hours, Mbeki's sensor team collected more data on a Vethri vessel's operational profile than the entire UAD had previously possessed. When the vessel finally altered course, heading back toward the heliopause, back toward the primacy of terms position, Mbeki shadowed it at 80,000 kilometers for another 40 hours, all the way to the edge of the buffer zone, maintaining her sensor documentation until the vessel cleared the heliopause and passed out of direct monitoring range. Her mission report, filed upon return, was 37 pages long. Most of it was technical data. But the final paragraph read, "The vessel at no point demonstrated distress consistent with a genuine navigation system failure. Drive output was consistent throughout, suggesting full propulsion control was maintained. Sensor activity during the correction period was substantially elevated above what navigation troubleshooting would require, and the array configurations observed were more consistent with active environmental survey, specifically active survey of UAD assets and approach corridor characteristics. It is this officer's assessment that the vessel was gathering information, and that the navigation error explanation was a post hoc justification for an authorized intelligence gathering operation that encountered and intercept it had not anticipated." Asante read the report and forwarded it to Osei with a single annotation, "They checked us. We were already there." The 8th negotiating session convened 3 days after the Resolute returned from its shadow operation. The Vethri envoy made no reference to the Waypoint 11 incident. Osei made no reference to the Waypoint 11 incident. The session proceeded on the established agenda. But something had shifted. The Vethri delegation's approach on the military oversight clause was different in the 8th session, not because they had conceded the principle, but because the specific language of their new proposal had changed in ways that Kirchner identified immediately. The previous proposals had centered on compact authority to review and advise on military deployments. The new proposal offered a framework for mutual information sharing on security developments, with response timelines that were, in practice, too long to function as a real veto. It was not everything Osei wanted. It was not the compact acknowledging that humanity had the right to defend itself without asking permission. But it was language that acknowledged the solar system as humanity's operational domain in a way the previous proposals had not. They came in expecting to find a buffer zone civilization grateful for whatever terms we offered, Kirchner said in the post-session debrief. They found a civilization with a functioning outer system patrol capacity, a command structure that reads treaty language like lawyers, and the operational patience to shadow an intelligence vessel for 40 hours rather than make a scene. She paused. They've revised their threat model. Good, said Osei. She picked up the new Vethri proposal and began reading it with a highlighter. The revised proposal took 2 more sessions to negotiate into final language. The clause that ultimately appeared in the agreed provisional admission framework read, in translation, "The Sol system government retains full operational authority over security activities within defined home system boundaries. Information exchange on significant security developments will occur through established communication channels on a best efforts basis." Best efforts basis. Not approval required. Not authorization requested. Best efforts basis. It was not a declaration of sovereignty. It was not a formal recognition of humanity's right to unilateral defense. It was bureaucratic language, carefully chosen, that left room for multiple interpretations. But under the interpretation humanity's legal team had documented in a 50-page analysis, it meant this. Within the Sol system, humanity made the calls. The Vethri envoy signed the provisional admission framework on behalf of the Compact's authorized contact party. Director General Osei signed on behalf of humanity. The ceremony was conducted via translation relay, lasting approximately 20 minutes. There was no public announcement for 6 weeks. The UAD wanted time to review the full document before releasing even a summary. When the announcement came, it described humanity's provisional admission to the Galactic Administrative Compact in measured, careful terms. It acknowledged the framework. It noted the ongoing nature of the process. It said nothing about the 7 months of negotiation that had preceded the signing, or the Waypoint 11 incident, or the counter-document, or the 4-hour private session. Those details came out later. They always do. The Provisional Admission Framework had been in effect for 14 months when the Vethri hegemony made what would later be described, in academic papers and in the popular history of the era, as a serious miscalculation. It did not look like a miscalculation at the time. It looked, from the available documentation of Vethri strategic thinking in that period, like a reasonable test of the limits of language they believed they had drafted to their advantage. The military oversight clause's best efforts basis language had always been ambiguous, deliberately so from the Vethri perspective. They had accepted it expecting that ambiguity to eventually resolve in their favor, as ambiguity in treaty language tends to do when one party has more leverage than the other. The Vethri had not fully updated their leverage assessment. The incident that triggered what humanity formally designated the Quarantine Directive began as a transit authorization dispute. A Vethri commercial fleet, 11 vessels, registered to a compact licensed mining operation, filed a transit notification with the compact's administrative body indicating their intention to pass through the Sol system's outer transit corridor en route to a resource extraction zone in a neighboring star system. The notification cited the transit corridor as a compact registered route, which it technically was. It had been included in the compact's navigational charts for several hundred years, predating humanity's space capability by a comfortable margin. The filing did not request permission from the UAD. It notified the compact administration. Under the Vethri's interpretation of the Provisional Admission Framework, this was sufficient. A compact registered route, used by compact members, transiting the outer buffer zone of a provisional member did not, in their reading, require bilateral authorization from the provisional member. The UAD received a copy of the transit notification as a courtesy communication, routine forwarding of compact administrative filings affecting the Sol buffer zone. The notification landed in a standard monitoring queue and was flagged by a junior analyst who, to her considerable credit, recognized immediately that something important was happening and escalated it the same hour. Asante had the file on his desk within 3 hours. He read it twice. He then called Osei, who read it once and told her assistant to cancel her afternoon. The operational question was specific. 11 commercial vessels, estimated transit time through the outer corridor approximately 72 hours, closest approach to any UAD installation roughly 400 million kilometers. No weaponry declared. No military registry. No stated intent beyond transit. The strategic question was not about those 11 vessels. The strategic question was about what happened if humanity accepted the Vethri's interpretation of the transit rights framework. If the UAD logged this notification, allowed the fleet to pass, and set the precedent that compact registered routes through the Sol system's outer transit corridor could be used without bilateral authorization from Earth. Because if that precedent was set, the corridor that humanity had, through 14 months of careful operational positioning, effectively managed as a controlled approach to the inner system became an open lane. And if it was an open lane for Vethri commercial fleets, it was an open lane for everything with a compact registry. Kirchner's analysis was on Osei's desk in 6 hours. Her conclusion was unambiguous. This is a framing move. The 11 vessels are not the point. The filing is the point. If we allow the filing to stand unchallenged, we have established the precedent that we do not control transit through our own outer approach corridor. Every subsequent transit, commercial or otherwise, will cite this precedent. This is how treaty language that was ambiguous becomes treaty language that means what one party always intended it to mean. Osei convened a full strategic session. She gave the room 3 hours to debate and listen to every position. Then she made her decision. The UAD transmitted a formal response to the compact administrative body, not to the Vethri fleet directly, but to the administrative body that had received the transit notification. The response was methodical, citing the specific clauses of the Provisional Admission Framework relevant to home system boundary definition and the best efforts basis information sharing requirement. It argued, with documentation, that any transit through a route intersecting with the defined Sol home system zone required prior notification to and acknowledgement from the UAD, not merely notification to the compact administration. It requested that the pending transit be held pending resolution of the jurisdictional question. Simultaneously, Asante issued deployment orders. The Resolute and its companion vessel, the Endurance, were repositioned to the outer corridor waypoints. 3 additional UAD vessels, a medium survey platform and 2 escort-class ships, were quietly transferred from their logged operational areas to outer system support positions. The transfer was logged in standard operational records. UAD operational status reports were updated and transmitted to the compact monitoring channel, as they always were. Nobody hid anything. Nobody made threats. The UAD simply updated its operational record to reflect where its ships were and what they were doing, as it did every week. The compact administrative body took 9 days to respond to the jurisdictional query. In the interim, the Vethari commercial fleet held position at the heliopause. There was no confrontation. Nobody moved toward anyone else. The UAD vessels maintained their waypoint positions and conducted their logged operational activities. The Vethari fleet maintained their holding position and presumably had extensive discussions with the primacy of terms and with Vethari Home Authority. The compact administrative body's response, when it came, did not fully resolve the jurisdictional question. That was the subject of a formal review process that would take another 8 months to complete. But it did indicate that pending resolution, the transit notification was considered incomplete and that the requesting party was encouraged to seek clarification from the Sol Systems Provisional Government Authority. In other words, ask Earth first. The Vethari commercial fleet withdrew to compact space without completing the transit. They filed a revised notification 6 weeks later, this time including a direct communication to UAD requesting transit acknowledgement. OSE's team responded within 48 hours, acknowledging the request, providing the requested transit window, and specifying a transit lane that kept the fleet at a comfortable distance from UAD's outer system installations. The fleet transited without incident. It was, from any external perspective, a routine commercial operation. But the filing that preceded it contained language that had not been present in the original notification. It acknowledged the UAD as the relevant authority for Sol System transit coordination. It used the word request rather than notification. It was a small word. In the context of what it had taken to establish, it was enormous. The quarantine directive, as it became known in UAD internal documentation, was not a single dramatic order. It was the accumulated body of policy, operational posture and legal precedent that humanity had spent 2 years carefully constructing. The framework through which the Sol System's outer approaches became, in practice, managed space. Not closed space. Not aggressively denied space. Managed space where the entity doing the managing was Earth. The Vethari hegemony understood, after the commercial fleet transit dispute, that the provisional admission framework's ambiguous language had resolved in the way it had not intended. The best efforts basis clause, combined with the home system boundary definition humanity had negotiated and the operational posture the UAD had maintained throughout, added up to something that functioned in practice as a controlled border. Ships could still pass. Commerce could still move. The compact's navigational routes were acknowledged. But they passed through space that humanity was paying attention to, with assets that were capable of making their attention felt, under a legal framework that required anyone who wanted to transit to at least tell Earth they were coming. It was not everything. It was not a formal territorial claim recognized by the full compact membership. It was not guaranteed to hold against every future challenge. But it was real, and it was grounded in 2 years of patient, disciplined work, legal, diplomatic, operational, by a civilization that had never had any intention of being managed by someone else. The formal review of the Sol System transit jurisdiction question was completed 22 months after the commercial fleet incident. The compact's administrative review body, a panel of 9 species with no direct economic stake in the outcome, issued a 40-page ruling that was, by compact standards, unusually candid in its reasoning. The ruling found in humanity's favor on the jurisdictional question. It established that the provisional admission framework's home system boundary definition, as negotiated and documented, gave the Sol Systems Provisional Government Authority meaningful coordination rights over transit activities intersecting that boundary. It did not give Earth a veto over compact registered transit. But it required prior notification to and acknowledgement from UAD for any transit, commercial or otherwise, that intersected the defined zone. The ruling also contained a passage that had no direct legal effect but was quoted in virtually every subsequent analysis of the Terran exclusion zone affair. In a section addressing the historical context of the dispute, the review body wrote, It is noted that the provisional members' government demonstrated, throughout the proceedings under review, a consistent and documented understanding of relevant framework provisions at a level of detail unusual for a civilization at this stage of compact engagement. The review body observes that this level of engagement, while adding complexity to the present proceedings, is consistent with the framework's stated objective of incorporating member civilizations in ways that reflect their actual developmental status. Actual developmental status. The Compact's own review body was, in carefully bureaucratic language, noting that humanity had shown up to these proceedings better prepared than expected, and that the framework was supposed to accommodate that. There is a document in the UEAD's historical archive, now partially declassified, that attempts to reconstruct what the Vetheri hegemony's internal strategic assessment of humanity looked like at various points throughout the Terran exclusion zone affair. It was compiled from compact diplomatic communications, observable changes in Vetheri operational behavior, and the retrospective accounts of several members of the original negotiating team. In the period before first contact, the assessment was simple: a promising pre-compact civilization, not yet at a stage requiring serious engagement, developing at a pace consistent with the established buffer zone timeline. Standard monitoring, standard protection, standard eventual incorporation. Probably 40 to 60 years out from any meaningful engagement. Not a priority. After the first signals were exchanged and the benchmarks reviewed, a civilization that had developed faster than projected, clearing several benchmarks ahead of schedule, requiring earlier engagement than anticipated. Still manageable. Standard first contact proceedings, standard admission framework. Priority elevated but not significantly. After the counter document, a civilization with a sophisticated legal and diplomatic capability that had, apparently, spent the 14 months of the translation process becoming expert in compact administrative law. A non-standard negotiating partner. The admission proceedings would require more resources than initially allocated. Priority elevated further. After the Waypoint 11 incident, a civilization with an operational outer system presence capable of responding to intelligence activities without warning or advance notice. A patrol capacity that had not been in the projected development timeline. The military oversight clause was more complicated than initially assessed. Full reassessment recommended. After the commercial fleet transit dispute, a civilization that understood treaty language as a strategic tool and was willing to use the Compact's own administrative mechanisms to enforce interpretations favorable to its own interests. A civilization that had, through documented legal process, established operational control over the approach to its home system without firing a single weapon, issuing a single formal threat, or creating any situation that could be framed as aggression within the Compact's framework. The final entry in the reconstructed assessment, dated approximately 6 months after the transit jurisdiction ruling, read as follows. Translated from Vetheri administrative language with the careful qualifications that all such translations carried. The Sol System provisional member presents a strategic profile that does not conform to standard incorporation models. It has demonstrated legal, operational, and diplomatic capabilities that, in combination, produce outcomes equivalent to what an established mid-tier compact member could achieve, without the formal standing that would require the compact to treat those outcomes as binding on other members. It has done this systematically, without provocation, and without apparent awareness of how unusual this is. Recommend reassessment of all pending resource interest positions in and near Sol System Transit Corridor. Further recommendation: avoid situations that require determining whether the Sol System government's capabilities extend beyond the positions they have thus far chosen to take. Avoid situations that require determining whether their capabilities extend beyond the positions they have chosen to take. Director General Osei received the transit jurisdiction ruling in her office on a Wednesday morning. She read it. She forwarded it to the relevant departments with appropriate annotations. She sent a brief personal message to Professor Kirchner and Dr. Bello acknowledging their contributions. She authorized a public statement, carefully worded, describing the ruling as an important step in the ongoing process of formalizing humanity's relationship with the wider galactic community. She did not hold a press conference. She did not make a speech. She did not describe the ruling as a victory or a vindication, or evidence of anything in particular about humanity's character or capability. When a journalist, in a routine briefing 3 weeks later, asked her directly whether she thought humanity had handled the compact negotiations well, she paused for a moment before answering. "I think we handled it as well as the situation required," she said. "Which is all you can ask of anyone." There is a footnote to the Terran exclusion zone affair that did not become widely known until several years after the transit jurisdiction ruling. It concerns the Compact's 7 developmental benchmarks, the criteria by which a buffer zone civilization's readiness for full Compact membership was assessed. When the benchmarks had been established 400 years earlier, at the time of the Sol buffer zone's original designation, the Compact's assessment body had projected that a civilization beginning from Earth's then current state of development would require approximately 600 years to clear all 7 benchmarks. The projection was based on historical averages across dozens of previous buffer zone civilizations. Humanity, from the point of first contact, took 11 years to clear the remaining benchmarks and achieve full Compact membership. The last benchmark, the one concerning coordinated interstellar defense, was certified not by a military engagement or a weapons demonstration, but by a review of the UAD's operational record throughout the preceding decade, the outer system patrol capacity, the transit corridor management framework, the legal and diplomatic posture, the sustained, coordinated response to a series of challenges that had been met without escalation, without panic, and without conceding anything essential. The certification panel summary document noted that this approach to the benchmark, establishing a functional defensive posture through legal architecture, operational presence, and diplomatic precision rather than through force demonstration, was the first time in Compact history that any civilization had achieved benchmark 7 by this method. It was not noted as exceptional in a congratulatory sense. It was noted as unusual in a way that suggested the certification panel was still working out exactly what it meant. The Vethari hegemony's formal position on the Terran exclusion zone affair, in all subsequent Compact proceedings, was that the events had proceeded normally and that the incorporation of the Sol system civilization had followed standard framework procedures with some natural variation in timeline and negotiating detail. This was, in the strictly technical sense, not entirely untrue. Privately, the Vethari had, within 3 years of the transit jurisdiction ruling, voluntarily ceased all intelligence-gathering operations targeting UAD outer system installations. They had also, with considerably less publicity, revised their standard brief for commercial operations near buffer zone civilizations to include a new section titled, Assessment of Host Civilization Operational Capacity. The section recommended that before filing any transit or operational notifications involving a buffer zone or provisional member system, Vethari commercial entities conduct a thorough review of that civilization's monitoring and response capabilities. It specifically cited as a reference case the Sol system. Humanity did not emerge from the Terran exclusion zone affair as a galactic superpower. It did not defeat an empire or repel an invasion or demonstrate some unique evolutionary advantage that made it special in the cosmic order. It was not the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically advanced species in the Compact. It was one civilization among hundreds, working within a framework it had not designed, navigating relationships with entities far older and, in many respects, far more experienced. What it had demonstrated, over 11 years of careful, disciplined, unglamorous work, was something more durable than strength. It had demonstrated that it paid attention, that it read the documents, that it showed up to every meeting prepared, that when it drew a line, the line was in a real place and was backed by real capability, and that it would hold the line through legal challenge, through operational persistence, and through the kind of composure that comes from knowing exactly what you're defending and why. The Vethari hegemony had arrived expecting to manage the terms of humanity's incorporation into the galactic community. They had encountered, instead, a civilization that had already decided what its terms were, and had spent 2 years quietly making sure the framework agreed. That is not a story about humanity being exceptional. It is a story about what happens when an intelligent species, facing circumstances that could have provoked fear or aggression, chooses instead to be methodical. The galaxy, it turned out, had plenty of powerful civilizations. It had very few methodical ones.